Occasionally you'll hear us academics making jokes which can be lighthearted or bitter about possibly never retiring, dying in the classroom, teaching, dying doing while we are engaged with the things that we have to do or prefer to do. And I'm going to tell you the story about somebody for whom that actually came to pass in his late 80s, as far as I remember. And this is back when I was in graduate school at Southern Illinois University Carbondale in the 1990s and early 2000s. And I think this happened in the late 90s, if I recall. So there was a Professor Emeritus Lewis Hahn, and he was a really interesting fellow who had, done a lot of different things within the department. He'd been the department chair. He'd actually been a department chair not just at Southern, but at other places before that. And he also had been the director of graduate studies. This is all long before I got there. By the time that I arrived at Southern Illinois University in 1995, he had retired, so that was the emeritus status, but he was still quite active in the department in several different ways. And so one of the ways was he was the second editor for the Library of Living Philosophers series, which Southern Illinois University and I think Open Court Press helped to provide. And this was a massive undertaking where you were taking really important living philosophers who'd not yet died, but were probably getting up there in the years. And then you would assemble articles and interviews and, critical reviews of their works and essays from other philosophers. And actually my mentor, Garth, he participated in one, I want to say, on Gabriel Marcel. Again, it's a little bit hazy because this is more than 30 years ago. No, it was 25 years ago for a lot of this stuff. And Lewis Hahn led these things. And so this kind of leads to a second way in which he was heavily involved in the department. So I actually needed an office when I got there, and they'd run out of office space, so they put me in an emeritus professor's office, who wasn't Hahn, somebody else, but close to the Library of Living Philosophers. So he'd poke his head in every once in a while and say, who are you and what are you doing in there? And we would chat in the hallways. And as it turns out, it was really quite funny. We used to joke about this, that if you named somebody who was important in the philosophical community, whether an analytic or a classical American or a continental philosopher, or even, since Hahn traveled to East Asia, a Chinese or Japanese philosopher, odds are Lewis Hahn not only knew the person and had run into them once or twice, but had probably had a conversation with them. And so, he saw me carrying Derrida's On Grammatology in the French, which my mother just brought back from Paris, a trip to Paris for me. She went into some bookstores and bought some stuff, and I'm reading it. And I was really into Derrida at the time. And I ran into him in the hallway, and he's like, "Oh, you're reading Derrida, huh?" And then he'd start going into his stories. "Yeah, I remember talking with Derrida at this point in time, and he was interested in this, and I asked him these questions." and we actually had another joke about Hahn as well, not just that he knew everybody, but that if you wanted to be able to get out of a conversation with him, because his mind was just a vast network of associations and memories, and he would just talk at you until you found a way to close the conversation. He wasn't interested in ending a conversation that had started. You had to like make sure that you had something to do somewhere else at a particular time. So you could say, oh, well, it's really nice talking with you. I got to go do this. But he was a veritable, the proverbial gold mine of information. You could go into his office, and he was there generally 5 days a week working away on his stuff, and he was always happy to stop and essentially answer questions and tell you stories. And he'd known everybody. He'd known John Dewey, who was a really big person within American philosophy and pragmatism, but also massively important at Southern Illinois, where we had the Dewey Center and 2 Dewey scholars. He knew all these people all over the world, and he would tell you about them. So that was a second way in which he remained very, very active within the department. The third way, and this is what led to his eventual demise, or didn't maybe lead to it, but was an occasion of it happening, was when there were events within the department, he would show up. He was not one of these, I'm retired, I don't do that sort of stuff anymore. This is what he lived for. And so one of the most common things that we would see him showing up for, we had this seminar room where a lot of our seminar-style classes would take place. And it was not a classroom as such. Think of it as more like a bigger office that had a gigantic table in the middle of it with chairs arranged all around the table. There was a chalkboard behind. And then there were another row of chairs in the back. So, anywhere from 20 to 25 people could sit fairly comfortably in there. I mean, it would get a little stale, the air, if the door was closed. But otherwise, it was pretty good. And that's where we would have not only the classes, but also this series that was called Agora. And this is kind of a cool feature. And sometimes you have these sorts of things in departments. So, the Agora means the marketplace. This is really quite important for the history of philosophy. Socrates did philosophy in the marketplace. So when you talk about Agora in philosophy, you mean something like an exchange of ideas. Somebody's working on something, they bring in their project, maybe they read a paper, maybe they put stuff up on the chalkboard, maybe they've got handouts. And it could be us graduate students. I actually did a few Agora myself, which one was on Thomas Aquinas. I think one was on Aristotle. I don't know. I think I may have done more than that, but I don't remember. But professors would do them as well. And so we graduate students and often other professors would show up. And Lewis Hahn was there quite often participating in these. And he would usually sit right next to the speaker. It's sort of a place of honor because he was the oldest of all of our professors and really a well-known, well-connected guy and somebody of great goodwill as well. So he would sit there, and sometimes you would catch him kind of, nodding off. He worked long hours, even as somebody in his 80s, long since retired. And so, nobody would make anything of him, nodding off, occasionally snoring very lightly. But usually when he would nod off, he'd be there, and his eyes would close, and he'd lean forward a bit. And then, 5 minutes later, he'd jerk up again. And sometimes it was clear that he wasn't actually dozing because he would ask questions about the stuff that had been covered when it appeared that he'd been sleeping, and it would be dead on. So he almost always had something to say or something to ask. So he was really a major contributor to the department in that third way. This is what it means to be a colleague, part of a faculty. So anyway, we are in a presentation, and I want to say this is while I was still taking courses, So maybe it's before 2000, and I'm sitting kind of at the end of the table. And, Lewis Hahn, of course, is next to the speaker, who is Pat Manfredi, one of our professors, who I think went on to become a dean at Southern Illinois University. Like maybe he was in charge of the honors program or something like that. Really nice guy, interested in analytic philosophy, I think primarily in epistemology, was married to a Wittgenstein scholar who unfortunately got cancer and died. I actually worked under her, Donna Summerfield, and tried to do a master's thesis under her. That's a whole other story. So anyway, Manfredi is reading this paper that he has, and we see Lewis Hahn, starting to, his eyes closing and starting to doze off again. And we're just kind of, I'm just kind of watching him while I'm listening to Manfredi. And then suddenly something different happened. So Lewis Hahn, his head pitches forward, his shoulders go down, and his head hits the table with a real smack, a deep smack, not what I did with my hands, a thud. And everyone's like, whoa, what's going on here? And Manfredi has got his papers, and I remember like the look in his eyes, and it was kind of in between surprise and concern and horror. And he looks down at Hahn, and Hahn isn't moving. His head is still on the table, and everyone is like, whoa, what is happening here? And I don't remember if it was Manfredi or somebody else. Maybe the department chair was like, all right, everybody out, show's over, get out of here. We're going to call the ambulance and see what is going on. So long story short, an ambulance arrives. A lot of people are out in the hallway. Of course, the paramedics are like, everyone get the hell out of the way. And they come and they get him onto a gurney. And that took some doing. I mean, there's an elevator way down at the end, and you've got to go through all these hallways to get to it. And they take him out and take him to the hospital. And I don't remember if it was a heart attack or a stroke, but he didn't regain consciousness as far as I remember, and he died not that long afterwards. So he didn't immediately die in the classroom doing what he wanted to do, doing what he thought was really valuable, engaging in the activity of philosophy in a collegial manner. But it was pretty close to the end of his life. And I think about him every once in a while. I never had a interaction with him that wasn't enjoyable, jovial, enlightening in certain respects. He really was quite a person. I never, of course, took classes with him because he was long retired by the time that I arrived in graduate school, but we got to benefit from his experience, his insights, his vast knowledge of who was connected to who. And he was, I'll say this, he was in some respects part of an atmosphere. You knew that he was there in his office, toiling away at this important work, the Library of Living Philosophers, that was part of what, contributed to research, put SIU on the map or kept us on the map. And at the same time, he was always ready to engage in the practice of philosophy with other people. So it was a significant loss, but one that was going to happen sooner or later because we all do pass away. And, I think about him and the example that he set. Would I want to myself teach long enough that if inevitably we're all going to die, would I prefer to die sitting in a lounge chair, sipping a tropical drink on a beach, kind of doing nothing? Or would I prefer to die in the deathbed at home with family around asking what my last wishes are, or, in a hospital somewhere? Or would I prefer to keel over and die in the classroom, giving a talk, going to somebody else's talk. I mean, the latter is perhaps a bit more disconcerting for the other people involved, right? Especially if they haven't seen people having medical issues or let alone dying. But in a way, it might be the best way to go, right? I mean, family or work, your calling, both of those are probably good ways to go. If it was a crappy job that you don't like, dying on that wouldn't be very fun. Random, acts of violence or car crashes or stuff like that don't strike me as a particularly great way to go either. And so, Hahn went out doing what exactly he had wanted to do for the last, 60, 70 years of his life, something that he'd been practicing. And it strikes me as a prime example of what we often call a good death. So that's my story about Lewis Hahn, a little bit about his life, a little bit about his impact in the professional setting and educational setting that I knew him in, and some of the outlines of a good, meaningful ending of that very life.